Osiris.
All right, check. How's everybody doing? Check. 1, 2, 3. Is this thing live? Are we live now or what, folks? Biscuits are alive. Just coming off the Revolution in Motion. Friday night Webster Hall sold out. Show, concert, extravaganza, debut. Released with a movie on YouTube. Check my Twitter X profile if you want to link to that. There's all the songs released on Spotify, Apple Music. And the show had cardboard cutouts, folks. The show had live vocal performers. Cloudcore, the producer of the album, came on stage and played a song with us. There was video accompaniment on the video wall for every single song. There were happy fans everywhere. The cheers were gigantic. It's crazy because people know and love these songs, but they hadn't heard them in order yet. We had managed to keep that a secret almost to the very end, so kudos to the whole org. And we debuted the space opera in order the day that the album came out. The podcasts have been dropping to explain all the details to everybody. It's a full immersive experience. The only thing we haven't done for it at this point is the ice skating, Revolution Motion on Ice show, which let me tell you, we're working on that hardcore. We're gonna get that done for you all. Really happy about this last week. Then we took 2 huge victory laps in Buffalo, which was, sold out on Easter Sunday in Buffalo. Felt pretty damn good. Saturday sold out a long time ago. And, Sunday was just like a little coup de grace. The next day was my birthday. And it was just like a real amazing 4-day run for me. Super happy to have spent it with the band, with the fans, and watch everybody hit home runs and score touchdowns all weekend long. It was amazing. We did all the sounds, we did all the new jams, we did all the new vibes, but we also displayed what was a lot of hard work, great artistry, and a great collaborative team effort to make the Revolution in Motion album a forever album in your playlist of best albums of all time. I mean, look at that. We got everything done. We made an album that was true to the Disco Biscuits, and yet still a studio album. Still with the huge jams, still with the peaks. And that peak of Why We Dance guitar solo part is one of my favorite peaks we've ever made on an album. And there's a bunch of peaks. The peak of The Deal is crazy during the vocals. It's so fun. So we got a really good job on that. And it's just been an album of victory laps. It's been a week of victory laps. It's been a week of victory laps for us and a lot of smiles. Everybody's psyched. The bubble of positivity rolls on into a city near you. I mean, here we go to Texas, Dallas, Houston, Austin, New Orleans tonight, Louisville last night. Some of the fans who are at the Louisville show were like, this is the best show we've ever seen you guys play. We are getting that every single night at this point. So we must be doing something right. I think we're just metamorphosizing into the band that the Biscuits have always been practicing to become. We're metamorphosizing into a polished, solid version of that band. It's a lot of fun. So we'll see you all out on the road. I'm very happy that the podcast has been an integral part of the last few weeks. So thanks, Max. Thanks, Crunk. Everybody's doing a great job over at Osiris. We have a nice team going on right now. And it's just a wonderful time to be making music, to be out there in the cities, playing concerts for people. Super excited about it. We're playing Atlanta in 2 weeks. Very excited about that show. That is Saturday, April 15th. And we're playing a bunch. We're playing Asheville. We're playing Raleigh. We're doing all North Carolina shows. So we haven't played these rooms in a minute, and I'm excited to go back. So this is our plan for now. I hope everybody comes out to the shows and I get to see you. This has been an incredible time. And, I don't really have any and he points on this podcast to make, in my usual fashion, of a rant. But one thing did happen to me. On my birthday, I flew from Buffalo to Louisville, and I got on the plane, and the plane drove out on the tarmac to take off, and then sat there for 3.5 hours. And they came on the PA system, and they told us every 20 minutes that we had to wait another 20 minutes. Does anyone know why this happens? What is this infatuation with the airlines with having you wait on the tarmac? Is it some weird power play by them? I don't understand. We had to drive back to the airport twice. The first time, we drove all the way back to the gate after 2 hours. And they're like, all right, we're gonna let you out of the plane. And you hear everybody in the plane be like, oh my God, thank God I get to get out of the plane. And then they're like, psych, we're going back out to the runway, psych. And they drove us back out to the runway. We waited another 1.5 hours. And then we drove back to the airport. And then they're like, get in line and we'll rebook you. It was insane. I don't understand these airlines. I get it that they have a very hard job and that gas prices are high. But what happened? What happened in the 5 minutes from when we left the gate to went all the way out to the tarmac to take off that they couldn't have figured out while we were at the gate? You know, why didn't they just leave us in the airport? I think there's some profit motive there. They got to put you on the tarmac to take your money, I think is what it is. And then once they put you on the tarmac, they can take your money, and then they can figure out how to make you happy after that. And if they don't put you out on the tarmac, you can't take your money because the flight never took off. And I really think it's something like that. Like they had no intention of flying you anywhere. There's just a weird loophole in the rules where they got to sit you on the tarmac. Because it happens all the time. All right, that's my grouse of the week. I really can't even complain about that. It happened again the next day too, which was crazy. But I can't even complain about that because stuff is so solid right now that it just is, you know, I'll sit on the tarmac 4 hours every single week if we could have the kind of weekend this weekend that we had last weekend. You know what I mean? It's worth it. It is worth it. And that's where you want to get as a jam band guitarist, is when the traveling is worth it. When all the packing and traveling and lows and goodbyes and all that stuff that goes into being a touring musician for real is worth it when you're out on stage and people are cheesing and jumping and having, you know, the people are telling you it's the best show of their lives. Every single night of the week. Last week, somebody told me it's the best show of their life. And that's crazy. And I'm going to take that win. We're going to take that W and bring it on stage tonight in New Orleans. Hope to see you there. We're mass communicating.
Welcome back to Touchdowns All Day. I am your host, Max Dawson, coming to you live on tape from within the bubble of positivity. And I mean it, guys. I am still buzzing from the show at Webster Hall on March 29th, the release party for Revolution in Motion. Truly one of the most special experiences in my, 26 years with this band. I was at the Hot Air Balloon debut in 1998 at Silk City. I was at the debut of the Chemical Warfare Brigade in 2000. And as special as those experiences were, there was something in the air in New York. I've never seen a Disco Biscuits crowd as locked in. The energy, the sense of pride amongst every person in that auditorium, it truly felt like we as a community had accomplished something. And I want to tip my hat to the entire band, to Joey, to 1111 management, Andrew Kaplan, to the entire crew, and everyone who was in that room that night for the parts they played in creating an experience that none of us will ever forget. Don't take my word for it. Here's what Andrew from the Hudson Valley had to say on the Touchdowns All Day hotline, 424-666-SIYD.
What up, guys? Just calling in. Wanted to give my unending support and admiration for the space opera that I witnessed on Friday night in New York City. Absolutely perfect, beginning to end. The guest appearances were some of the craziest shit I've ever seen. Just perfect music, front to back. I loved how he just executed this amazing, brilliant vision. And shout out to the podcast for giving the background and all these stories about what was going on, and it made it 10 times better. So long live the biscuits, B4L, peace out.
Andrew, I couldn't have said it better myself. Thank you for your kind words. Thanks for your calls. Keep them coming. 424-666-SIYD. Hit us on the socials at TDADbaby on X, at Touchdowns All Day on Instagram. We've got a great Facebook group that's growing where I sometimes release sneak previews of upcoming episodes and some cool extra materials that end up on the cutting room floor. Join the conversation. We are, as John always likes to say, mass communicating, and we absolutely love hearing from you. While you're at it, please, I always ask, head over to iTunes, wherever you get your podcasts, and leave us a 5-star review. And you might as well share an episode with a friend. Believe it or not, there are still people out there who love the biscuits who are not listening to Touchdowns All Day. And at this point, if you are going to the shows, even if you're listening to every single note that gets played on Nugs and you're not listening to Touchdowns All Day, you're not getting the full experience. Because it's only on Touchdowns All Day, for example, will you hear Magner talk about the samples or the risers or the Mindlift body jams that end up becoming some of the defining elements of future tours. Listen to Touchdowns All Day today so that tomorrow, when you're in the pit, when you're on the balcony, or when you're just listening at home on Nugs to the streams, so you get that inside perspective on what's going on inside the band members' heads as they're making the music that's setting the jam band community on fire in 2024. Today's interview is a good one. I sat down with Derek Van Schoten, aka Cloud Chord. Now, you might know Cloud Chord from his mentorship of the band during the 2019 iteration of Tractor Beam. You might know him from his production work on the trio of instrumentals, M1, Lakeshore Drive, and Evolve. But today we're going to talk about Cloud Chord's work as the producer of Revolution in Motion, his collaboration with John, Joey, and the rest of the band, and his perspectives on everything that has been taking place in this historic year of 2024. Ladies and gentlemen, it's with great pride and pleasure that I present to you the final installment of the Touchdowns All Day 5-part miniseries on the making of the Disco Biscuits' new double album, Revolution in Motion. Welcome back to the podcast, Derek Van Schoten, Cloud Chord.
What's up, Max? Great to see you.
Great to see you as well. Now, Derek, many Biscuits fans know you through your role as one of the band's Tractor Beam coaches. And John even had you on for an entire episode of Touchdowns All Day, episode 23, to talk about your work in helping the individual band members incorporate Ableton into their stage setups.
Right.
I went back and listened to that episode last night, and I realized in that entire interview, John never really asked you any questions about yourself or your work outside the band. So I wanted to start out with a really basic question, and that is, who is Cloud Chord?
Well, I know all of these guys I know all of them personally through living in Brooklyn for a while. And my old moniker was DVS, which is my initials. And I think I ended up playing with or opening for pretty much every Biscuits side project between 2010 and 2013. So John was doing M80 Dub Station. Mark and Aaron were doing Conspirator. Dr. Famous and I did a bunch of co-bills where we actually played a lot of music together as a duo. And so that's how I got to know them personally. But an actual fun fact, about 5 years before that, or something in the 2007, 2008, all those guys did an Everyone Orchestra with my wife, and she was a singer. So I actually kind of became connected to them earlier than that. So
your history involves interacting with the Biscuits through different collaborations in and around the jam community, but I know that your Cloud Chord project, your Cloud Chord career, would probably more typically be categorized as down-tempo electronic music as opposed to jam music.
Totally.
What is the trajectory that took you from, I don't know if it is from electronic production to jam band music, or is it from jam band music to electronic music?
That's a great question. Like, what is the chicken and what is the egg here, right? I'm going to quote Mark Brownstein and get into character. One time he said, "Cloud Chord, I love that you speak jam band." So I speak jam band because I grew up in upstate New York, and in the early 90s, I saw The Dead, and I saw Fish, and I saw the Horde Tour, which are all the sprouts in the embryos for a band like the Disco Biscuits. So I was, I'm a little bit younger than some of them, but I'm roughly the same age as those guys. So I have a lot of the same cultural references, a lot of the same musical references. So I think that's why they called me in, is because I got the concept of a jam band. I understand spiritually and culturally what they're channeling and what they're trying to achieve. But I also have an electronic musician producer mindset. So I can take the lineage of Jerry and Trey and Horde Tour and all those scenes and all those festivals and channel it into a techno jam. You know what I mean?
Now, it's fairly commonplace in 2024 for us to acknowledge the overlap or the conversation between electronic music and jam music.
Sure.
Whether it's Pretty Lights, LPGOB, Cloud Chord,
Sure.
the Biscuits, but not too long ago, they seemed to be very separate worlds. And bands like the Biscuits, the New Deal, Soundtried Sector 9 were instrumental in breaking down some of those barriers. Earlier in your career, earlier in your life, just as a music fan and musician, did you see the worlds as being connected, or did it require some sort of shift in mindset on your part to be able to connect these two portions of your musical expression?
I've always been somebody that loves connecting disparate creative energies. So for me, it felt natural. And I see two things that are disparate, and I think Reese's Pieces instead of, oh, that is a square peg in a round hole. I've always been that way. Like, to me, for example, in the 90s, Afro sound system, which combined trip hop from the 90s, electronic music back then, and traditional Irish music, that made complete sense to me, you know? And then I got into hip hop that was very sample based, and that made complete sense to me. Even when they were sampling Motown or classical music, I was like, this is dope. I get it. So for me, I always saw them as naturally intertwining, especially culturally speaking. because there's a lot of experimentation and you don't know what's going to happen. And, like, for example, Tipper, who was a very electronic act, hardcore bass, psychedelic bass music, he's always pushing the envelope with his expression and his colors in the same way that a band like the Biscuits do with their improvisation. So to me, culturally, it's, I guess they meet at hippie.
You said improvisation, and to me, I think very much of improvisation, obviously, as being the cornerstone or the foundational concept in jam band music. Electronic music, at least the perception, I think, is that it lacks the flexibility. There is a more of a rigidity imposed by the reliance upon technology, on clocks, on samples, etc., that prevent the same sort of loose, experimental, exploratory playing that characterizes so much jam music. Now, I'm saying this as a straw man to knock it all down, because obviously, starting with the Dead, starting even before, the hippies have always been playing with electronics and technology. The Dead in their MIDI period in the 90s is a great example of that. But the Biscuits and their incorporation of Ableton as well. How have you approached the blending of the looseness and improvisational nature of jam music and the technological elements of electronic music and studio-based production that might not necessarily lend themselves to the same amount of flexibility?
Right. Are you saying how I do that in my career or how I did that with Revolution in Motion?
Well, starting with your career, because you've been in a role of coach and mentor to the Biscuits. So I think it'll be instrumental to understand how you've approached it personally, and then how you've imparted some of that to them.
Totally. Well, I'll start with one time when I opened for them. I came out and the first thing I said is, hey, I know you guys would prefer to have jam bands open, but just think of me as a one-man band. And then I went and did my thing, So it's, for me, and I've said this in lots of interviews in the past, elegantly combining the innovation of electronic music production with the freedom of improvisation. To me, that's the holy grail of music, personally speaking. To have the freedom to go out on a wing like somebody like Derek Trucks does in a 10-minute solo, but then also like to be able to really have your shit slap sometimes that bands struggle with. I'm going to be real with you. When I go to a Fish show, I wish I could hear the kick drum more, and I wish I could hear the sub frequencies of Mike's bass more. That is not a diss on them as a band. It's just a cultural musical taste thing that I've been accustomed to from being in electronic music scenes. It's like, I want my sternum to go when the kick drum comes down, you know what I mean? So like when I go to a jam band show, sometimes I'm like, can you turn down the keys a little bit? Can you turn down the guitar? Can you turn up the kick drum? So it's something I'm always thinking about. And I think the trick is to know your strengths. And that's something that we talked a lot about in Tractor Beam and with this album is let's incorporate ideas, but like they're not going to try to become a straight techno band because their gift to the world is their ability to open up into mysterious new zones. And that's why they have the diehard fans that they do. They come for that. They come for the unexpected. And that's also why they brush off what non-fans may deem as sloppiness. They just see it as cuts and bruises on the way to glory. You know what I mean?
Indeed. I always talk about it's the danger with the Biscuits that draws me in, that they play on the edge. It's not perfect, but only by eschewing perfection can you sometimes achieve those moments of the sublime.
Sure.
You talked about when you go to a traditional quote unquote jam show, what's missing. And I think it's really interesting because you've been obviously so involved in the philosophy, but also the technology that really defines the band's sound right now.
Sure.
You've been on some shows opening recently as Colorado. And I found in my own experience as a concert attendee that they have really gotten to a place where Rich and the front of house crew and the entire production is starting to achieve something akin to that sound that you're describing, that
Absolutely.
where it hits you in your sternum, where the kick is uncompromising.
Yes.
You were involved in the earliest phases of the second period of Tractor Beam, the 2019, 2020 DJ mixes, Space Cookie, taking the band into these new directions. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the project's evolution, both in terms of the compositions, the technology, the sound, what you heard in Colorado, and how it relates to the work that you and the band were involved in prior to COVID.
Right. I think the simplest explanation is back in 2019, as a collective, me and Tractor Beam and Space Cookie, we were listening to others to find Tractor Beam sound. But that was because it's like when blues cats are learning Albert King and BB King and Clapton licks. Like you have to, the only way out is through, to be successful at that sound. So we had to do that. We had to listen to other people. And we were literally doing that because it was a great idea of let's have a band that is known for jamming authentically play down sections of epic DJ sets. That is not easy. That's one of the most technically challenging projects I've ever been part of in my career thus far, hands down, because there's so many moving parts to that to get it to land, So 2019, we're listening to others. Fast forward to now, this year, I listened to the whole Fox show. They were listening to themselves. You know what I mean? So, and I talked with a little bit with Magner about it. And I asked about the prep, and he said it wasn't really that they even had to do much prep. They were already there. And they had developed their sound. They had come full circle, and they were just able to authentically express the sound of Tractor Beam without it being, oh my God, what are we going to do tonight?
It's interesting to me that Tractor Beam used to be a defined segment. You could mark the beginning of Tractor Beam and you could mark the end.
Yep.
It had set repertoire of compositions, and that is not to say that it was in any way predictable or overly structured, but it had boundaries around it that separated it from the rest of a Disco Biscuit show. That isn't the case anymore.
Right. And at the time, it was intentional.
How so? Talk to me about the intention.
So it was intentional from a set list point of view, that it was always a little bit into second set every night. And it's almost like their versions of drum and space. And we literally had this conversation. That's our drum and space. It's Tractor Beam, right? So, but I remember at the time, they had a different front of house guy, and he literally had different settings on his console for when Tractor Beam. And I remember being at the Best Buy shows for New Year's and standing at the console, and he would turn over to me and go, Tractor Beam engaged. And it'd be like a new, and faders would change, and then the side chain would start happening. And we were authentically in that zone. So that was intentional. But I think to what you just said, and to the point that I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, it's like now they've arrived and they can listen to themselves. So it's like when the superhero can fully control it. You know what I mean? So they can.
Yes.
So Clark Kent can be Superman for 2 minutes if he needs to, and then he can jump back and be the nerd, or be the other guy. So it's a cool superpower that they're finding themselves starting to be able to control.
Well, Tractor Beam in those 2019 segments in particular, I credit with reigniting my interest in the band. I had taken a large step away from the Biscuit scene for about more than 15 years. And I dipped back in 2019, just with the announcement of Set Break is over, and heard some of the early Tractor Beam segments and thought to myself, this is what I always wanted the Biscuits to sound like. And again, for the initial period, it was a set portion of the show. It might be 20, 30 minutes, it might be less, but like Drums in Space, you could always sort of pinpoint it. The beauty today is that it really has no boundaries, and it suffuses any song, any composition. It could be from the first notes of the first set, it could be in the encore, and it could be spontaneously transitioned into and out of, seemingly without the sort of encumbrances of requiring a whole separate set of automations and fader settings and front of house configurations. Mm-hmm. Do you know, obviously this is probably more a question for Rich than for you, but do you know if there were any technological developments or new advances that made it possible for the band to so seamlessly go in and out of what we now think of as tractor beam, which is not really a repertoire, but more like a style or a philosophy?
Right. I don't know how much Rich is doing on his end. That would be a question for him and maybe the guys, but I can tell you things that are tangible from a fan's point of view. A lot of times when Mark jumps from bass to synth bass, right? When Magner samples vocal stuff, with John, he used to do a lot of the synth guitar, which he isn't doing too much of anymore. But I will say that over the past few years, I've seen an incredible refinement and controlling of his tone. And it's gotten really great to where it kind of fits really well in either world without a ton of adjustment. I'm sure he's doing some different things and he has some different patches, but so he's just kind of right there. And then I can say, as far as Alan goes, he used a mostly electronic drum set for the tractor beam. So when they go literally tractor beam, for him, it's totally different gear, But I think they've all really done their homework as for like what would make a techno band a techno band. What are those elements? And each member has really dug into that.
I am really curious to hear your thoughts and reactions to the most recent incarnation of Tractor Beam. You said you mentioned that you listened to that Fox show. I'd like to play you a little excerpt from that show and get your feedback as we listen to it. And I specifically selected a song that you have a history with. There you go. So tell me what you're hearing from your standpoint, both as producer and coach, hearing your wards, your students take your lessons into the world and incorporate some new lessons as well.
Right. Well, I can tell you that Alan is phrasing like a DJ and not a jam band drummer. That's a big part of it. So that means two things. That his sound selection it's not a rock band sound selection, his drums. And two, he's thinking much more like strictly like a drum loop inside of a CDJ or inside of a really great dance tune. There's some fills there, there's some building, there's some dynamics, but it's not nearly the blood and guts ebb and flow that an improvisational rock band has. So that's the first one. Second one, they're all playing with much more restraint, you know, at least in that little section.
Yes.
There was experimentation, but it was, I would almost call it ornamentation versus improvisation, right? It's like the difference between water skiing in the wake and then downhill skiing where you're going all over the place. They're in a wake and they're coming out a little bit here and there, but they're just staying the course, which is what dance music is.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but you were involved in the production and even perhaps the composition of M1?
M1, maybe a tiny bit. Yeah, I mean, on the first 3 songs, there was a gray area there where we didn't have a bigger picture in mind yet. They were just excited to be finishing songs. And there were some times where I would just be like, hey guys, what do you think? For example, Evolve, one of the first sounds you hear in the first 4 measures, there's an actual Rhodes part that I played and they loved it. And they're like, that just is the bow on the whole present. You know what I mean? So there's a little bit of that. And, you know, my catalog and my experiences with instrumental music. So that's something I tend to have a lot of ideas on, you know?
How did you go from Tractor Beam coach to Disco Biscuits producer on those 3 instrumentals? Those being, of course, Evolve, M1, and Lakeshore Drive.
Yes. Well, I will also say there's probably like 30 unfinished demos from the instrumental era. So,
really?
Some interesting stuff of just, you know, lots of jams. But to answer your question more directly, so I came in 2019. They were poised to have an epic year in 2020. We all know what happened in 2020. Then they went to, you know, playing drive-throughs and things like that, or drive-in movie theaters, and doing other projects. And I went my separate way, but we still stayed in touch because we were friends. And then in 2021, that summer, I was doing a trip to the Northeast and I hollered at those guys. And I was like, hey, I'm in the Northeast. Do you guys want to like just try to kick it and make some music for a couple days? And now I know that Alan lives out west, so we wouldn't have Alan, but the rest of the 3 live relatively close to each other. I rolled up with an Ableton session that had probably 40 house beats that I made for the hang. And I just sat at Barber's desk and I DJ'd beats while they all jammed and I recorded them at the same time. So I was like drummer DJ / audio engineer, you know? We did a couple days of that and then they were stoked about it and they were stoked for the momentum. So there was a good while, probably 8, 9, 10 months where I was going out to Philly once, if not twice a month. And, you know, acting is wearing many hats, producer, engineer, co-writer, editor, whatever needed to happen, you know? So it just kind of organically came from me reaching out and saying, hey, do you guys want to jam?
Do you have a general philosophy or approach you apply as a producer? For example, we all know there are producers like Rick Rubin who are curators or gurus or creative directors. And then conversely, we know of producers who are effectively one man or one woman bands who do everything from writing or co-writing through engineering, through playing multiple instruments. How would you describe yourself and your approach as a producer?
So, well, a little bit of it has changed through the process of Revolution Motion in a sense that I learned a lot from them and from working with them. Before Revolution Motion, I would say one of my hallmarks that a lot of people talk about with Cloud Chord is that I'm highly prolific. But why am I prolific? I'm not prolific just for prolific sake of look at me, but I hit my stride when I stopped caring about perfection. And I was okay with it because I came from bands that wanted perfection and all that stuff. And then I had friends that were into bass music that were just like nitty gritty perfection. And I was like, you know what? I want to like just write some raw hip hop stuff that has some live instruments that might only be 2 minutes long. That makes me happy. So it's what made me happy, you know? And so for several years, my philosophy was like, don't overthink it, keep it raw, keep pushing, keep going, you know, don't be afraid to say this song is done and I'm moving on to the next one, which is what a lot of people earlier in their career have, or lots of people throughout their career have a problem with, is calling it done. And I got over that hump creatively, which is what made me prolific. So coming into this project, I feel like that's one of the attributes that I brought to the table is being a voice of reason sometimes of, we could work on this forever, but I don't know that it would make it better. You know, we could take out these 8 bars, we could redo the solo, we could change the snare drum, we could tinker forever, but it wouldn't necessarily be better. So I feel like that's the thing that I brought to the table. Now, what they brought to the table that I learned is sometimes it is okay to sleep on it and wake up and say, okay, I admit it's not done. I thought it was yesterday, but now it's not because I think this idea is actually good. And so being patient with yourself and allowing things to unfold, allowing new ideas to unfold. And you and I talked about this in San Diego, that as a producer, I always felt like my competition on this record was the roaring crowd and lasers. And that was the benchmark of energy. And so literally, if we're going with football analogies, halfway through the 4th quarter on this album, Joey has the idea of let's reference, because, you know, Joey is a Disco Biscuits encyclopedia, right? All hail Joey the Firewall. I call him the Firewall because nothing gets past him. So
that's great.
He had a meticulous list of the best, like everybody's best version of this song. So he'd be like, John did this on the deal at the Caves, and Magner did this on Shocked in Montana, or whatever it was, you know? And so he had a really great methodical list, and we would literally bring these versions in to the gigantic song file that we're producing. And we went through all of them that weren't finished. And we were like, okay, this needs the dub piano that he did in Montana. And this needs the same arc of the solo that he did in Tennessee. And so that was a great final coming together of everything, of how, okay, now we're literally channeling the band live into these from disparate performances.
Well, that was a question I certainly had to ask you later, and that was, to what extent did you allow the band's performance of this material, which in some cases there are 2+ years of performances of these songs, influence your approach to producing them? Were the studio tracks intended to be the ultimate version, you know, encased in amber, a frozen moment, or were they meant to replicate some of the more noteworthy and memorable performances of these songs in the wild?
Spiritually, I resonate with the second one. And I see albums more like diary entries than the perfect be all end all, right? Especially with a band like this, because again, they leave a lot to chance. And one of these songs might get a new section over the next year. Maybe all of them do. You know what I mean? To where they're like, actually, this is the way we play Shocked now, you know, because of what we did in Aspen or Reno or whatever.
I'd imagine as a producer, it could be almost maddening to think, okay, we finally got this song locked. And then they go out and Aaron comes up with a new way to top the jam that then becomes the hook for that entire composition. And you've got to go redo One Chance so that you've got the new, that new soaring major key section that they added, well, I don't know, 6 months after the song debuted.
Yep. And that was one of the final things to finish. And to, you know, we had a lot of versions of that particular song.
First song to be composed about a decade before the project even kicked off, and perhaps last to finish. Amazing.
Yes,
well, I wanted to wind back and ask you, how did the band pitch the concept of this project to you? Because it wasn't just, we loved how you did the 3 tractor beam inspired instrumentals, let's make an album. It was
right.
And then they go into the Unst Dungeon and the aliens come and the freeze and the queen and the whole mythology. Tell me about the first time they sat you down and pitched the entire concept to you.
Well, I think it came in a couple different layers, because when we were doing M1, Evolve, and Lakeshore Drive, at that point, it was just understood that I was their producer and I was helping them become more prolific and starting to release songs with much more regularity. That was the page that we were all collectively on. So the goal was to start releasing like 1 instrumental a month. So we were all hustling, and that was something that inspired them and invigorated them. And then around May, the rock opera really started to take shape, right? But I don't think I was fully educated on the entirety of the concept until later that summer, because it was still in the beginning of the rock opera, but it was kind of presented of like, oh, hey, now we're doing vocal songs, you know, and we think that this might be an album, but we're going to do some vocal songs. So they kind of started sneaking it in there, and Who's in Charge was the first vocal song that we did that is from here. But I don't think at the time of Who's in Charge, when we shipped that off to the world, there wasn't talk of like, oh, this is in the second half of Revolution in Motion. You know, it really took shape. Honestly, I think I was one of the last ones to know, which is good though, because that means they were all communicating and getting a group message to bring to me.
John and Joey have talked about the ways in which the narrative arc of the space opera has made composing some of those songs somewhat easier than it is when they sit down with a blank page, or maybe with a loop or a sample or a track from John's demo file, and just have to write Photograph or Ring the Doorbell Twice from scratch. Sure. How about for you? Working as a producer, did the story, the mythology, the characters, and the arc factor in how you approached it from the standpoint of creating the sounds, creating the sort of motifs that unify and make this not just a collection of singles, but actually a concept album?
Yeah, it did. It was a good challenge, and it was a challenge all the way to the very end for a couple reasons. One, when you have a concept album like that, you want continuity, in your message, in your musicality, and for my job, in your sounds and your sound design and your mix quality, right? So my challenge though was when we were finishing songs in August of 23, they had to hold up with songs that we made in May of 22. And it had to sound continuous, right? Especially because we didn't release these songs in order that they're all going to end up being, right? Like Who's in Charge doesn't start the whole album, right? So that was one of my big challenges. Like, okay, now all that I know, can this still hold up alongside Who's in Charge? So that was the heavy mental lifting that I had to do towards the end. That I was kind of on my own for, which was great because that was my job. But I think, by and large, the nucleus of this album was me and John and Joey and Aaron. And it wasn't the other guys weren't engaged. There just wasn't as much for them to do, And so like we had the drum parts, we had the bass parts, we went in and tracked them. And then just the overdubs of guitar, synth, and vocals is seemingly infinite in variations, right? And so, but all that being said, since it was just the four of us, it was a lot easier to stay on message and stay focused because there was less daily opinions. Most of my opinions were just like mixed based. I tried to give them as much musical freedom and expression as possible and not to be too heavy handed with that. Although occasionally I did. Occasionally I would be like, for example, in Spaga, I played some of those funk guitars. In Twisted in the Road, I played the lap steel and I played some of the metal guitars, all like supporting things. Like I'm not trying to be the star of the show, but it's just more like, hey, here's a little ornament for the Christmas tree, because there's a little spot there.
I imagine your challenge being akin to a director shooting a film. Obviously, it's shot out of sequence, but over the course of the production, one of your characters gets a new haircut, the other one gains 20 pounds, another one gets a conspicuous piercing. Did you ever,
all the stuff.
Did you ever get a chance to go back to Who's in Charge or some of those earlier tracks and update them based on directions that the project had evolved into over the intervening months?
Well, great question. And Max, this is a teachable moment for all the budding producers out there. When you release songs, they get a code that is called ISRC. It's a particular code, a long number that is married to the sound file, to the image of the sound file. And that is how distributors track the plays of your song, okay? They track that image of your sound file to that number. Where I'm going with this whole thing with ISRCs is that unless you're the level of Kanye West and you have the superstars like that, where you have the skeleton key to Spotify and everything, you run the risk when you re-upload things of it resetting that entire song. So if you have a song that 782 people played, if you're like, man, we got a new outro, let's re-upload it. A lot of times it'll get flagged and then it'll restart over it because they're seeing it as a brand new song. So that was something we had to be very, very careful about, is we didn't want to have any of these songs lose momentum, right? It's like Who's in Charge did well. We don't want it to go back to zero and all these people who saved this song, now they don't have that song anymore because it's a new ISRC and the old one doesn't exist or whatever, So that being said, if you're a wizard, you can occasionally get away with it. And we did it a couple times.
Are you able to tell us which tracks, or is that a trade secret?
Another Plan of Attack. There was some real delicate, I felt like the person in the movie where there's all the lasers and you got to go like this, to get really Ocean's 11 style. Like, don't trip the wire, don't let distribution figure it out. But we, Another Plan of Attack, we replaced one vocal phrase. And that was it right at the end. And so that was tricky because I had to get the exact same render length and I couldn't change all the levels on anything else. And I mean, the problem is that there's a little bit of mystery here. So like we could have changed more and we didn't know and we would have got away with it. But we're just running the risk of getting caught,
Yeah. So back to when you first came on board. Well, I guess you were already on board as the band's producer, but when you accepted the assignment of producing Revolution in Motion, obviously it didn't even have that name yet, but you were working on this concept album. As you embarked on this project, were there any frames of reference, back to another film analogy? I know that at the beginning of any production, Martin Scorsese will set up a screening room on set and he'll bring his stars in and he'll show them John Ford movies and Ozu movies. And, he'll basically curate a film festival of the work that has inspired his thinking and how he approaches this new project. Were there any albums, artists, even beyond the realm of music, science fiction films or novels that influenced your approach to Revolution in Motion?
Yeah, I'd say it's more than on a macro level, it would be on a micro level. In that, for example, in Freeze, we worked a lot on the sound after they say freeze to get it to sound like ice. So there was a lot of sound design elements like that, where it's just imagination. So more than like, hey, we want a dead mouse type synth on this. It was more like, because we were sound designing for a literal plot, which actually kind of made it easier, because we were like, this is what is happening in this song. Is this the best sound to illustrate that, right? Same with Shocked too. Like, can we get sounds in here in the funk jam in the middle that sound like electricity? So there's a little bit of that. And actually, here's a fun fact that not a lot of people know. Very early in the process of this, when we were doing the 3 instrumentals, John and I had a whiteboard in the studio, which eventually became the song list for Revolution in Motion. But originally, and I have the picture on my phone, it's just like 3 years old, so it would take me like 10 minutes of scrolling to get there. But it was all vibes of like music vibes that we liked and what we liked about it. So, for example, Robert Palmer's vocal sounds was one of them. John really liked them. And now that, if you think about it, John actually has a similar vocal style to Robert Palmer. Like, I'd put them on, maybe not in the same planet, but on the same solar system of vocal styles, right? There were certain dead mouse things, like dead mouse likes to hit the snare right before the kick. So it sounds like a flam. That kind of thing. And that way you hear the snare a little bit more. Be like, let's use that. Pink Floyd had a bunch of Texas shuffles. And he's like, let's merge a Texas shuffle with like rock guitar and then what the other guys do, So there was a bunch of different things like that were, I would almost call them the end of the old tractor beam philosophy of like listening to others, and referencing things. But it's neat. So there was a whiteboard with a lot of those generalities in them.
Well, I think I speak for a lot of the band's audience in saying, please find that photo. We would love to hear and see some of the influences that were swirling around your and John's head during the conversations that gave birth to this project. So, as we've discussed in prior chapters of our Revolution in Motion miniseries, John was producing demos for these tracks with Joey and Magner in the basement in his home.
Yep.
What did John bring you, and how much work was required to translate some of those demos, which now the audience has become a little more familiar with,
Mm-hmm.
to the final album versions that are either already out or will be released on March 29th?
Well, I think where we really built momentum on this and where they were really allowed to start listening to themselves, because that seems to be a theme of the night that we're going back to, like that line of creative demarcation, is when we went into Spice and we were able to live track Mark and Alan, right? Because we were starting with the roots of who they were with the band, with these songs. So what we did for both Spice sessions, I don't think I was at the second one, but I was at the first one. We had the demos, the original demos, and I stemmed them out so they jammed along with just particular things. Like a lot of times we would take out the techno beat and just let Alan be himself, and then maybe incorporate elements of it a month down the road, right? So because what we came, like Who's in Charge, I felt like we got right. But I felt like we kind of got lucky, and that it was a strong song and we made strong decisions relatively quickly. But what we were kind of running into after that is we were doing a lot of stuff remotely, and there was a lot of overdubs, and there was very little of all them being in a room at the same time and feeding off of each other. So when we went to Spice, we started getting more of that. And I think that's when we really started getting momentum there.
Was the Spice sessions, were they dedicated strictly to rhythm tracks, or did John and Aaron play live as well?
They were all there and they all played. Sometimes John wouldn't play and he would direct people, but I can tell you that on every song that we played there, I probably used at least a little bit of what John and Aaron did.
And I know that a lot of the songs, especially in their demo format, didn't have guitar solos or even guitar parts.
Right.
When were those added in?
Later on down the road, I think this one thing that we can celebrate that John and Joey achieved together is when Joey would say to John, I need studio John right now. I don't want live John. I want studio John, which is such a simple thing, but it really made the light bulb go off for John of how to change his phrasing. Because here's another thing. I always talked about how I'm competing with the lasers and with the crowd, right? What they're competing with themselves is long form versus short form. And because they're a long form band, they play a long time every show. Right? For them, a festival set is easy. They could play a 2-hour festival set and they're like, well, that was easy. There's just one set, right? I mean, they have stamina galore, right? So, but the trick in that is that if everything is a long jam, sometimes it's harder to get to the most epic, most centered, most seemingly perfect part for the song, right? And so that is where a little bit of where I came in, because I do so much of that. I'm always thinking, how can I get right to the best part? Because I'm a producer, right? So
in 2024, do the traditional constraints of 74 minutes or 18 minutes on a side of vinyl before you start to lose fidelity even matter? Were you thinking through how this would unfold over physical media? Because 14 tracks and it is a double album, it's a lot of material. Right. And if you took those 14 tracks at their average live length, it would be a 4 or 5 hour performance.
Totally. Yeah. So that was something, I'd say that's where I was continually the voice of reason, is how can we get the best of both worlds here, guys? How can we channel that energy and get the dopest parts live, like I referenced a few moments ago, make sure we're getting that heat in there, but also be like, this is the album version. You're not going to get an 11.5 minute type 2 jam after the bridge before the final chorus. You know what I mean? We actually finished this song. You know?
Now, your initial collaborations with the band were instrumentals, and it seemed like you were on a path where you were doing an instrumental a month, and then suddenly Audible, and you are working not only with songs with lyrics, but also with a lyricist.
Right.
Talk to us about working with Joey. Not just a lyricist at that, but a novice in the act and art of songwriting.
Right. No, so I think one of the... so let's zoom out here for a second. We continually hear this phrase these days. It's a really fun time to be a Disco Biscuits fan, right? So why is that? And the answer to that will help answer your questions right there, right? And why is it a fun time? Because they're playing well, because they're writing new material, because they are enjoying themselves clearly. So why is that? A big part of that is that they all are communicating with each other better than they ever have, right? And so a lot of life's problems are not that complicated to fix when you are eloquent at communicating with each other inside a group, right? So all that being said, I think there was challenges, of course, in the beginning with me coming from an expert world or whatever, and Joey being the new guy, but Joey also being very creatively engaged with the whole thing on multiple levels, whether it's, he flies to all the shows on his own dime. He's an amazing dude. He wants to be there. He's essentially the fifth member of the band at this point. He's hyper involved. As I said, he's got an encyclopedic knowledge of the entire band. So for whatever he may have frustrated me in the beginning because of the rub of him being a novice or a new guy, he also brought so much to the table that actually saved me a lot of time. He was my wingman on a lot of stuff of like, let's get this done. If you say this to John and I say this to Magner, I think we'll get it done. There was a lot of that. And there was a lot of...
He is the Disco Biscuits whisperer. Anytime I need to get something done, I ask Joey how I should phrase the question or the demand or the ask or whatever, and it invariably works. He knows how they interact, how they think. He knows the best way to get them into a creative and excited mindset to dedicate themselves to a project, whether it's an album or a podcast.
Totally. And so I will say in summary to all that stuff, the thing that I learned, not only as a human, but as a producer, is be willing to listen and willing to learn, even if you're considered an expertise in your fields at that gig or at that situation, so that you can grow. Because I didn't always have the right answers. A lot of times I did, and we came back to it. That was cool. But a lot of times I didn't, and I just needed to be quiet and listen and absorb the new ideas and realized that was the best idea that made the song the best version of what it could be.
So with the addition of vocals to these compositions, you're of course dealing with what has always been the Biscuits' biggest challenge, and that has been their singing.
Sure.
But I think that the album in particular does an amazing job of capturing both the charms inherent to their very specific voices,
right,
but also putting it into a polished framework that is acceptable for the average new listener.
Right.
And there's definitely, I think, a sense around this album that this is the album that a fan could enjoy, but also could play for their friend who isn't a fan and not have to apologize for an element of it.
Right.
How did you approach recording the band's vocals? One thing that John had mentioned to me was he'd throw layers of distortion and effects, digitization, alien sounds, obvious auto-tune on the demos, and then you'd take it all off and prefer a drier, more natural sound.
Right.
But I'm wondering how you approached their vocals and how you got them to the level where they are right now, which I think is about the best they've ever sounded, both on record and on stage.
Right. So this is where I was continually saying, this part of the record can't be like a jam band. If you want this album to be memorable, I'm sorry, guys, but the barometer for strong jam band vocals is not that high in this world. So let's find other references, you know? And so I think they did a good job on that and didn't try to. We never graded our vocals on a jam band curve. Let's just say that. We graded it on a world-class singing curve because that's what you want to do, right? You want your shit to hold up. So, and I think John got really serious about singing over the last 15, 20 months. And he got really real about it, you know? And I'm sure he had some real self-doubts that he at least did not share with me. But I think a lot of times self-doubt fuels growth, right? And so he really put his nose to the grindstone on getting strong vocal takes that weren't overly layered to cover up inadequacies, right? Because you were talking about how I strip things down. That kind of goes back to what I bring to the table is if we can get it done with one sound, let's do that because it will be more powerful and effective. Let's go for iconic versus clever. That's something I said a lot too. Like we could be clever and add all these things, but if we can do it with one sound instead of 7, that's what the average listener will really latch on to, right? So yeah, I think a lot of it was in John's court. And I will say that, you know, when they have added the vocal, let's just call it vocal production live, because it isn't always auto-tune. And even when it is, when they're using it live, they're using it in a very intelligent way. It isn't like how rappers use it, where it's just on stun mode, where it just fixes everything. Like they're changing the keys for the song and the scale, and if you put it on 100%, it's not going to sound good with a band. So they have to be, so it means that they still have to sing very well. It's a little tiny bit of bumper bowling. You know what I mean? But it's not a full safety valve that's down for them. So, but I think in terms of their bringing it back to their sound now and why they sound so good and why Tractor Beam is so tangible, a lot of it is actually the vocals, even though they don't do vocals in Tractor Beam, it's just that philosophy of getting the sound design for live dialed and grading yourself on a world-class electronic music curve versus a North American jam band curve, right?
Yeah. So of the 14 songs, I want to hear some thoughts on, for example, what was the song that was the biggest challenge that you worked the hardest on and shed the most blood, sweat, and tears over?
Okay. The most challenging song out of all of them. It would either be, I think, The Deal or To Be Continued. Because those are both just kind of two categories of songs on this record from a production point of view. There are epic, highly layered songs, and then there's more simple, sparse songs. So epic and highly layered would be The Deal. It would be To Be Continued. It would be Who's in Charge. More simple songs, Space Train. I'd consider Spaga a little bit more simple. There's a fair amount of layers, but they're not all happening at the same time, and it's pretty tight and simple, like you can hear every part. And I think Why We Dance is a little bit more simple too. So, but The Deal and To Be Continued, those were songs where we were really, really trying our hardest to authentically channel the energy of a live version, which is very hard to do when you're producing a song over the course of 7 to 8 months, instead of just taking that live version and just putting it out, you know? So I think with both of those, I mean, Who's in Charge maybe would be a close runner-up because there's so many versions of that. And there was a lot of, we think this is it. And then a light bulb went off and okay, is this, you know? And then you just have so many. I think actually, Who's in Charge? There might have been a little bit of, if I'm remembering correctly, and I'm not going to throw anybody under the bus, but a little bit of drama where I had to ask band members to stop sidebarring me for comments, because people would, instead of giving comments in the group and then yaying or naying it, people would come to me, have an idea, I'd take all this time, and then the other guys would hate it.
Yes.
And I was like, all right, you guys, there's no more sidebarring Cloud Chord. Like, we need to all be on the same page, because we're spinning our wheels in the mud.
Now, To Be Continued is an interesting song in that it is built off of a classic Biscuits jam that had a lot of history and a great deal of familiarity amongst the hardcore fan base. It was, something that consistently came up on the top jams of all time lists. Were you familiar with that when you were exposed to the demos? Did the original live spontaneous performance in any way filter into your approach to how you put together the final album version?
Yes. Remind me of which jam that one was based on.
That was the Vasilios from 2008.
Okay.
4/11/2008, I believe.
Cool. I can't remember because there was several versions of those on different songs. And also, like I said, there became a point by the end where it was like the demo, maybe a live version that this came from, and then other live versions for some notes, let's do this on the breakdown. This is what happened in Denver. But I do believe that a lot of these that, like this one, like To Be Continued, that came from an early version, if I'm remembering correctly, when I got the song file from those guys, that jam was still in there in the song file as a reference, which we needed, to stay on course and make sure we were headed in the right direction.
And now a song like The Deal, which was not based on a jam, I guess it was based on a moment of inspiration that River experienced while John and he were playing around in the basement. Mm-hmm. That song we just recently discussed in part 3 of our Revolution in Motion series as being unusually freighted with a tremendous amount of narrative importance. This is the kind of the crux of the entire rock opera, where the aliens and the Biscuits are put into one place, where the negotiation takes place, where the band becomes part alien, the fusing of their DNA with the electricity of the aliens. How did you approach that song, knowing not just that it was a very complex composition, but that it also represented perhaps the narrative crux of the entire cycle?
With great patience and difficulty, right? And that's why I said that was one of the hardest ones to finish, because two things in that one. We really needed the drop of the chorus to hit in an energetic and emotionally meaningful way, right? And there's the huge build with what they were referring to as the king riff that happens throughout the tune, and then it builds and it's just like it was challenging because we wanted to have the energy build, but going back to what I mentioned before, every time you add a new sound, all the other sounds get smaller, right? So you're flooding the zone, but all the parts become less significant. And so that is the great challenge of producing exciting electronic music, is balancing those two and staying on message. And that was a huge thing, is like The problem too, from a technical point of view, is right at the end of that riser section, John comes in with a hook. Let's make a deal, and deal is on the downbeat. So we had a fuck ton of music and sounds, and we still needed his vocals to come through in a very legible way and part the seas for the band to land, you know? So that just took a lot of patience and a lot of trial and error and a lot of, okay, if we're adding this sound, is there something we can take out to allow things so we're not crowding the fields, you know?
So from the songs that required the most work, give me the opposite. What song or songs were the closest to final version when John handed you the demo?
Good question. I think maybe Space Train. And maybe Why We Dance. I think we recut the vocals on Why We Dance, but a lot of the musical elements of the demo are still in the final version. That's a fun little fact there. So some of these songs, the more complex ones, by the time we got to the end, it was fully turned over to where like there was nothing original in there anymore. Everything at some point had been redone, right? But Why We Dance and I think Space Train are on the more simple side, especially in terms of texture. Like literally in the DAW and Ableton, there's less tracks. You know, something like The Dealer To Be Continued, we probably got, and same with Who's in Charge, we probably got to somewhere between 130 and 150 total tracks. Not all happening at the same time, but these are long songs with a bunch of different sections with a bunch of different sounds, right? So there's a lot of that. Whereas on Space Train, I think maybe there's 50 or less tracks. So, but I can tell you, I remember Space Train, that was one of those where I was like, sooner or later they're going to come around and they're going to realize that I'm right, that this song is done. I'm just going to wait. You know, and it was actually one of the last ones done because we spent so much time on the big epic ones that when they came around to the end, a lot of times they're like, yeah, you're probably right. It's good. We don't need to make this one overly complicated.
Now, this is admittedly an unfair question. Do you have a song that you're most proud of, a favorite song from the album?
Well, you know, when you and I talked about this a couple months ago, I had mentioned the simple ones, which kind of goes back to my whole MO and what I brought to the table is not overthinking, right? But I've thought a little bit about that since and just re-listening to some of this stuff. And I think I became so exhausted from the epic ones because I had to listen to them more and tinker with them more that I needed space from them to re-love them. And so I'm really proud of what we did with The Deal, and I'm really proud of what we did with To Be Continued. Specifically with To Be Continued because I think that's the best sounding track for the bass guitar on the entire record. Personally, because that's something that that's a very challenging thing in live electronic music, is to not just replace the electric bass with synth bass because it cuts through more and allow Mark to be himself. But here's another thing. When you're producing music, again, when you add lots of more layers on, the high end of the bass gets masked by percussion, cymbals, vocals, anything with high frequencies. So a lot of times then all you hear in the bass is the bottom end, because all of those top things that we hear in Phil Lesh's playing, or, you know, those kind of bass players, the attack, you hear it in Motown a lot too, because Motown isn't overly layered. It gets masked, it gets covered up. And I think we did a really good job in To Be Continued of having an epically layered song with the bass still being very powerful and cutting through.
And was that a matter of the mix, or was it a matter of, you know, Mark's setup or Mark's playing?
I think it's all the above. I think we got it right at every stage. Like he recut with the right bass, with the right playing, with the right attitude, with the right signal chain, and then I added the right things to it. I think we were batting 1,000 on that whole process.
Well, you've had this rare and perhaps unique experience of being able to hear every note in isolation, every constituent element without the effects. Are there other moments throughout the album like that Mark bass line from To Be Continued that no one probably will ever notice, but that you just remember or cherish as being the Biscuits doing something special, doing something noteworthy that obviously contributed to the greater whole, but that might not even stand out to the average listener in the final mix?
Yes. The guitar solo on Taurus. Okay. There was great deliberation of not having that at all because the Magner synth section, when they drop into that new, was so cool that it didn't need a solo. There was this great deliberation. We were at a crossroads because it was like, wow, it doesn't need it. Everything is total. Like we at our best Daft Punk moment here. Let's not ruin it. And then, so here's the punchline. John cut a solo, and I can tell you because I'm an Ableton expert and I have the guitar file, and you can't fool me. That I cannot be fooled is that the guitar solo on Taurus is one take.
Wow.
And that's why I stand for it. I went hard in the paint for keeping that one in because I was like, dude, you had a moment. This is what your fans love you for, is sometimes you just swing at it and you crack it and it goes out of the park. And you did it on this one. And I felt like it was such a special gift from the universe that he just nailed it in one take. Like I can tell you from the file that it's just one wave. He didn't patch it together. So that's a memorable moment for me because we didn't need it, but I feel like there was divine intervention that came through that gave us a reason for keeping it.
Well, that's amazing. And on behalf of the fans who love those moments, thank you for advocating for that.
Totally.
What's a song that surprised you the most? And I'll preface this question or qualify this question by saying that for me and many others, I think it's Baga's Last Stand, a song that was the last to debut, that has been the least explored on stage, but that in its studio incarnation has an accessibility and a crispness to it that makes it really a surprising standout.
Right. That might have been one of them for sure. That was a really fun one. It seemed to, there's very little struggle with Spaga. I'll tell you that. So that surprised me. What surprised me on the tail end, like when I just listened to on Spotify or once when it was out, was Freeze. So, because Freeze was done in the midst of all these other ones, and it needed a lot of attention, but not to the level that some of these bigger ones did. Like Times Square needed a lot of attention, even though it's minimal, just to get it all to sit right. It actually took a lot of work. And then I mentioned the other ones like The Deal and To Be Continued that took a lot of work. But the Freeze, like I listened to it when I was on tour in a car, on somebody's, or in a rental car on an iPhone, Spotify through the USB, and I was like, damn, this sounds really good. Like it's hitting on this system, So not that I doubted any of our abilities, but I was like, man, yeah, like we got it right. It's hitting via a phone in a rental car. That's a great listening environment to have a win inside of.
So you've been in the auditorium for a number of Biscuit shows on this tour. You and I spent some time backstage in San Diego, which has already been elevated to the status of one of the band's most legendary performances, including that second half of the second set, where a lot of the tractor beam lessons seem to spontaneously coalesce and birth a new sound that's really defined the band's playing since then.
Totally.
How, to your ears, has the experience of creating this album influenced the band's live performances? And I have a specific thing in mind. A couple episodes back, I asked Aaron to talk to me about the risers, which had become such a prominent part of his palette in fall of 2023 and still are very important, to the extent that many of the most well-received jams of the 2024 tour still prominently feature those risers that, according to Aaron, a lot of which he created at your prompting so that you could have elements to incorporate into the studio sessions.
Right.
So again, to rephrase the long meandering question, have you heard the album spilling out into the live shows? Not just the material, but the sounds and the techniques that you and the band developed in the creation of this piece?
Yeah, I'd say from two ways you can hear it. You can hear it in the sound design, which is like the sound. For the people who don't know what sound design it means, let's just call it selection of sounds, sound choices. Like, what sound does John have on his guitar right now? Is Mark playing his electric bass? You know, is he playing up high and doing an octave low, so now his bass sounds even bigger? You know, is Aaron playing a tried and true dance synth for this song? You know, what does Alan have on his sampler right now? You know, those are all things that I listen to immediately, maybe not even consciously. I just notice them right away, right? So those are all things that I noticed them succeeding at and becoming more quickly. So that's on the technical end. And also we talked about the vocal processing live. That's a great deliberate choice to tighten things up, polish things off. And then I'd say on the musical side, I really feel like they've gotten better at getting to the good parts that they're individually playing and collectively as a result playing in their jams. I feel like they're getting better at being group improvisational, but not in the way that frustrates non-jam band fans about, like, they just sound like they're meandering. They're not telling a story. You know what I mean? I feel like they've gotten a lot better at true collective storytelling.
So these songs now, by the time this episode comes out, all 14 of them will be in the wild. And one thing I know that a number of fans, especially those who are themselves amateur or semi-professional producers, DJs, etc., have on their minds is, will there ever be remixes, or will these stems ever see the light of day so that people might take their own crack at remixing some of their favorite Revolution in Motion songs? As a remixer, as someone who's remixed some of the band's tracks previously, do you think that there are any possibilities, leaving aside any kind of legal or economic considerations, as an artist, just for these songs to be reinterpreted?
Yes, I have two answers to that. One, I have strongly encouraged them to give this album a second life further on down the road, via remixes, via instrumentals. I was like, hey, let's make one long mix of the album and put it on YouTube that's just instrumentals. That'd be kind of neat, right? And then I have joked about remixing the entire album myself. I don't know that I have time to do that. But it's a pipe dream of me, of just like, you know how they do like the director's cut? Like my version of that, you know, and I'm not saying it's better. This would be just, if completely left to my own devices without consideration of audience, this is what I might do with this record.
Well, that's something exciting to potentially look forward to. Beyond that, what is next for this collaboration between you and the Disco Biscuits?
It's a good question. I don't know. I think we're in mysterious territory now, which I am embracing. Clearly, we love each other, and it's a functional working relationship. So I think what I will say is, and I've talked with the band and their management about this, is that now that they're playing like they're playing live, and that they're all communicating better, and that they have the 3 instrumentals in this full album, that they have the wind at their back, I think they could do stuff more often and it wouldn't take as much time. For example, I said, guys, I honestly think if you have these new songs written, go into Spice, send them to me. We could make a 4-song EP in a month. This doesn't have to drag out forever. Just bring me in for a month or 2 and we'll just like bam, bam, bam. Because now we have our process, right? So I am hopeful for them, whether they use me or somebody else or whatever it is that makes the most sense for them, that they continue this momentum, and that they dig in, and that they're willing to, I think it'd be great if they released new material in August. Why not? How about a new single this summer? I think that'd be great. And that's a very modern approach to releasing music. So I'm hoping, and that's something that I encouraged, and one of the reasons why they brought me in is because I release music so regularly. I kind of release it without fear. I was like, here's another one. You get a song. Everyone gets a song,
And it's interesting because the Biscuits, I think, in their incarnation as a live band, are known for bringing songs to the stage really early in their development, for working a song out in front of a crowd, and for songs evolving over the course of many months, starting with really skeletal performances, instrumentals, or partially written. And then some of those songs end up becoming the cornerstones of the band's repertoire. However, we know over the course of their recording history, and we're still waiting for that Studio Magellan or that Studio Hot Air Balloon.
Right.
And so they have exercised a much more cautious approach. So I personally am in favor of that more emboldened approach to putting music out and to capitalizing on the creativity that comes from that process. The song still can evolve on stage. As you said, the album versions or the singles or the EPs don't need to exist as the final definitive form. That song can continue to grow and evolve over the course of many, many nights of being worked out in front of a crowd.
100%. 100%. Have you heard, on this topic, have you heard Funk Diddy?
Funk Diddy. Is Funk Diddy one of the original demos?
No. So Funk Diddy is, I'll send you the song. Probably less than 20 people on this planet have heard Funk Diddy. Funk Diddy was around the M1 Evolve era. And it never saw the light of day because it's like hip hop tempo. It's funk hip hop tempo. It's a demo that Magner brought in, and then everybody played their parts on it. Alan's on it too, and then we got Eric Benny Bloom from Lettuce to play trumpet on it, and it's out of character because it's not a house techno song. It's a little slower. It's instrumental, and there's a trumpet solo on it. And I'm on it too. So it's like a 3-way collab. Like basically I made a song out of the demo and getting Eric Benny Bloom, and I did it. And I'm always like, every once in a while I'm like, when are we going to release Funk Titty? Come on, let's do it. No fear. I think the fans would love it. Let's give them a 2-minute and 30-second funk song with trumpet on it. Just throw them a curveball. So we'll see. There's stuff out there.
Maybe it gets released via Touchdowns All Day at the end of this episode.
Sounds great.
Now you're coming to the conclusion of a process that's stretched out for about 2 years of your life. How does it feel to finally be, I mean, I know your work is technically done, but with the album street date coming up, how does it feel to see this project out of your hands and in the world?
It feels great. And I think at the end of the day, I was always here for them. And so more than me wanting to pat myself on the back, I'm excited for them to get their glory. And I honestly don't like, it feels great to be recognized, and thank you for having me. But I'm at the end of the day, I was here to help them deliver their message. And so I'm really happy that we got to the finish line and that they didn't give up, because they've had frustrations about releasing music in the past. And for all the reasons that we mentioned earlier, like about communication and inspiration, those are largely influential on us getting this whole project to the finish line.
Well, I think, you were talking earlier and you just harkened back to it. The question of why are the Disco Biscuits playing the way they are? Why is there this general sentiment that now is such a special time to be a member of the Disco Biscuits community?
Right.
And I think that from my standpoint, having been a part of this community on and off for 30 years, the answer has to do with not just the four of them, but the people that they're surrounding themselves with, the people who they are allowing to influence them, the ideas that they are opening themselves to. And that includes people like Joey, and it includes people like you.
Right.
And your influence in particular, I think, cannot be underestimated. Or cannot be overestimated. As I said, I was listening back to some of those 2019 Tractor Beam jams in preparation for this episode and being reminded of how unprecedented it was for the band to be doing that then.
Right.
And to listen to the most recent tour and to hear the ways in which they've taken what once was this cumbersome, unbelievably challenging technological and musical endeavor,
right,
and so smoothly and naturally incorporated it into what they do night in, night out. It's completely changed the sound and the direction of the band, and it's really, I think, a huge part of this renaissance, this new approach, the new technology, and the new creativity that it's unleashed. So I am so grateful for your participation, not just in the album, but just as a general sounding board and influence and facilitator of this incredible art that the band has been producing over the last few years.
Appreciate that.
So what's next for you now that you've got this off your plate? I know that you are, as you said, incredibly prolific, both with releasing your own music, releasing sample packs, scoring commercials, movies, teaching, your technical work with Ableton. What are the big things on your horizon, and anything that you'd like to promote and share with the Touchdowns All Day and Biscuits community?
Sure. Well, I'm excited. I'm doing a handful of shows with these guys, doing their Texas shows. I'm playing a late night in Buffalo after night 2. And then in June, it's funny because all my upcoming shows immediately are based around these guys, which is very serendipitous to your question. And then on June 1st, John and I are playing a show in Brooklyn where we're both doing solo sets with drummers, doing house sets. So I'm playing an entire house music set on June 1st in New York with the drummer of Tycho, who's a friend of mine. His name is Rory. So on the live end, those are things that are coming up. And on the recorded production end, I'm honestly, like, I think between now and June, I'm releasing a song almost every week. Like, I released an EP last week. I'm releasing a bossa nova next week. I have a song with Prob Cause, who is this awesome rapper who sings with Grizz. In April. This summer, here's one Hallmark thing that I can promote. This summer, I am rolling out an EP with a Haitian hand drummer and singer. His name is Jeff Pierre, and it's 5 songs, and it's true tropical house because he's from Haiti. He's from the Caribbean. So it melds my style of like funky lo-fi guitar and beats with his up-tempo, bright, shiny stuff. So this summer, not only am I playing some house gigs, but I'm releasing some house music.
Amazing. Now, I know you're at Cloudchord on Instagram, on X, you're on Facebook, you're on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Music, where else? What's the best way for people to follow you and to hear your latest music?
Well, I'd say as far as the best place to follow me, wherever you are most active, you can just find me at Cloudchord. So some people like Insta, some people like TikTok, some people like Amazon Music. Fortunately for me, I'm the same handle everywhere. It's Cloudchord. But also, if you just want to see the full big picture, cloudchord.net is my homepage. And that has my full discography and videos and my full bio about working with everybody from the Disco Biscuits to Marvel to Gatorade and all those cool stories.
Amazing. Well, last question, Derek. Will I see you on March 29th for the official record release party at Webster Hall?
You sure will. I'll see you there, brother.
Amazing. Can't wait. Derek, it's been a great time talking to you, and it's been an amazing experience listening to the music you and the band have been creating. Thank you for coming back to Touchdowns All Day.
My pleasure. Great questions, Max. Thanks for having me.
Derek Van Scoten, Cloudchord. I love that guy. One of the nicest guys on the scene, incredibly talented, and a huge part of the creative renaissance that the Biscuits have been experiencing. Thanks to Derek, we get to debut for you. This is it, the world premiere of an original Disco Biscuits Cloudchord collaboration featuring Eric Benny Bloom of Lettuce. Ladies and gentlemen, Funk Diddy.
communicate.
Touchdowns All Day is an Osiris media production. Check us out on the web at www.touchdownsallday.com and use the hashtag TouchdownsAllDay on all social platforms. John can be found at Barber Shreds, and I'm at FY Maxwell on X and Instagram. You can also find us at TDADBaby on X and at Touchdowns All Day on Instagram. This episode was written, produced, and edited by Max Dawson, with assistance from Crunk Mike and Osiris Media. We get our photographs from Tara Gracer and audio support from Rich Steele and Drew Granicelli. Special thanks to Mark, John, Aaron, Alan, and the entire Disco Biscuits organization, especially the road crew, Ben Baruch and Andrew Kaplan at 1111 Management, Andy Bazzani and Mike Walsh at the Biscuits Internet Project, Joey Friedman and Steve Martocci, Scott McClintock, Think Tank Dubs, and extra special thanks to Lisa Gutwillig, Deb Brownstein, Angelica Magner, Sandra O'Quinn, Andrea Rivers, and Avery McMahon. On behalf of John Barber, Crunk Mike, and the entire Touchdowns All Day family, this is Max Dawson saying, see you next time.
Osiris.